Imagine this a peaceful, quiet neighborhood, tidy houses, neat lawns, everything just so. But then one homeowner does something unexpected. A garden gnome. Yes, you heard it correctly. A plain, harmless garden gnome. And that's where it started. Now, the HOA, well, they weren't exactly happy. They issued a violation notice, not for a broken fence or the lawn being too tall. Number, they deemed it unauthorized mythical creatures. That's right, a mythical creature. In someone's front yard. No magic wand, no sword, just a little gnome minding its own business. And then, the next door neighbor decides to get involved. Instead of removing their gnome, they one-upped it. They put up a troll statue. Before anyone knew it, the whole street was getting in on the act. Fairies, elves, dragons. Maple Lane turned into a fantasy village. And the HOA? Well, they weren't pleased. Actually, they weren't pleased at all. They began sending out threats, telling everyone to remove their mythical creatures. But there's a twist. Nobody backed down. Instead, things just got larger. Maple Lane was one of those kinds of neighborhoods where everything just seemed so perfect. The kind of neighborhood where every house appeared to be straight out of a magazine. You know the kind, where everybody cuts their lawn on Saturday morning, the yard is immaculate, and the fence is newly painted. And at the hub of it all, the HOA, the Homeowners Association. They controlled the place. They enforced the rules, kept everything shipshape and everything uniform. So when one homeowner put a little, innocent garden gnome on the front yard, it wasn't a huge thing. Just a little something, right? It was sort of adorable even. Only the HOA didn't view it that way. Rather than thinking of it as a cute addition to the community, they viewed it as a transgression. The gnome to them wasn't simply a garden ornament. No, it was a mythical creature. And that was something that had no business in their carefully controlled world. Now, this wasn't your standard transgression, a broken fence or unruly grass. No, this was serious. The letter from the HOA indicated the homeowner was in breach of the community guidelines for unauthorized mythical creatures. Can you imagine? A legend, all over a little gnome. At first, the resident was simply confused. I mean, how in the world can something so little and innocent cause an issue? But to the HOA, this little gnome was the start of anarchy. So what did they do then? Well, they issued a warning, a violation notice, ordering the gnome to be taken down right away, or else further action would be taken. Now, most folks in Maple Lane would have just relocated the gnome, right? I mean, who actually wants to get into hot water with the HOA? It's just easier to just go along and not make a fuss. But that's not what they did here. No, this story takes a bit of a twist, because instead of backing down, the homeowner decided to stand their ground. They figured, I'm not doing anything wrong. It's just a gnome after all. So they didn't take it down. They left it right where it was, smack in the middle of the lawn, smiling as ever. And that's when the HOA said, okay, we're going to take it to the next level. They didn't just send a warning, they doubled up. They sent another letter, and this one was even more serious. It wasn't just a friendly reminder anymore. This was a threat of legal action. Now, can you imagine a fight over a garden gnome in court? It's ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, what were the HOA going to do? Hire a gnome exterminator? But not just the HOA were upset. Word began to spread around the neighborhood, and pretty soon the other neighbors began getting involved too. It began with whispers. A couple of neighbors would gossip about the gnome now and again. Some laughed about it. Others weren't really concerned. But one neighbor, one rather brazen one, felt it was time to take it a step further. And how did they do this? Easy. They visited the garden store, purchased something equally outrageous as the gnome, a troll statue. Yes, you heard correctly, a troll, the sort you typically find in fairy stories, large, grouchy, and not precisely suburban chic. But this individual wasn't going to be intimidated, and they made their point. They put the troll statue next to the gnome. Like, if you're going to make something of a gnome, then let's see how you'll handle a full-on mythical creature. It was like a little act of rebellion at first, perhaps a small protest. But then what went down was completely surprising. As the days passed, more and more of the neighbors were joining the rebellion. They didn't simply keep their lawns manicured and abide by the HOA's strict regulations. No, they began installing their own fantasy animals. Fair. And before long, it was obvious. Maple Lane was no longer a normal neighborhood. It was becoming a full-fledged fantasy land. It wasn't just a few people either. It was everyone. Well, nearly everyone. Some people were too frightened of the HOA's authority and didn't want a chance getting fined or sued, but most of the street stood up. Front yard by front yard, lawns were being transformed. It was as if entering a fairy tale. There were cardboard castles, painted trees resembling those in fairy tales, and tiny gnome villages springing up all over the place. And with each new edition of fantasy art, the HOA's authority began to slip just a little bit further away. Yes, they could write letters. Yes, they could send fines. But could they stop a whole neighborhood from enjoying themselves? By this time, the HOA had progressed from merely sending a violation letter to sending threatening legal notices. They were seriously taking it now. Their next letter was full of tough language. There were lawsuits threatened, and worse, fines that could amount to thousands of dollars. And that's when it got really interesting, because now it wasn't just about a gnome anymore. This was freedom of expression, the right of homeowners to ornament their lawns any way they desired, even if that included a few garden gnomes and a few trolls. Now, the HOA was always all about rules and regulations. But these were not just any rules. These were rules that had been passed down to ensure the neighborhood was uniform, to ensure everyone adhered to the same stringent standards. And that's where the issue was. For these new, innovative residents weren't simply disobeying. They were questioning the notion that rules could be this stiff, this controlling. And by doing so, they were creating a new definition for being a part of the community. Each new mythical being that showed up on the lawn was like a mini act of defiance. An act of defiance against the notion that all homes had to be the same, that all yards had to be perfect. Now, don't get me wrong, nobody wanted to dismantle the neighborhood. Nobody was attempting to hurt anyone or damage property, but these people, these fantasy rebels, wanted to demonstrate that it was all right to be a little bit different. It was all right to be funny, and they weren't going to let some HOA regulations take that away. But naturally, this wasn't going unnoticed. The HOA was getting angry. In fact, they were furious. They began calling the homeowners. They began threatening actual legal action if the Middle-earth invasion wasn't halted. And at this juncture, the community was split. On one hand, you had the folks who wanted to do what the rules said, those who were in fear of what the HOA would do. And on the other hand, you had those who felt that the HOA was overstepping in a big way, and that a bit of creativity shouldn't have such big penalties. Tempers were flaring, folks were beginning to take sides, and what had begun with a mere gnome was now an all-out standoff between the HOA and Maple Lane residents. But then, something even stranger happened. As tensions grew, more mythical creatures appeared. People started to get more creative. Gnomes were joined by fairies, dwarves, and even a dragon or two. It was as if each neighbor was saying, if you're going to mess with me over a gnome, you'd better be ready for the whole fantasy crew. Now the entire street was abuzz. Individuals who had previously been peacefully living their suburban existence were suddenly being swept up in something larger, something that had become a movement. And that's when the HOA made its ultimate move. So as the fantasy rebellion kept spreading, things began to get a bit out of hand, for the HOA at least. Initially, they were writing a few letters back and forth, threatening and demanding action. But now they were facing a full-blown movement. You see, the people of Maple Lane had begun something that couldn't be stopped. The gnome one homeowner had put out on the lawn was now the symbol of defiance. It wasn't a decoration. It was a statement that they weren't going to live according to the HOA's strict guidelines anymore. And the more mythical creatures appeared on lawns, the angrier the HOA became. They couldn't turn a blind eye anymore. It wasn't one homeowner anymore. It was the whole block, and possibly even more. And what could they do? Well, they decided to up the ante. Imagine how frustrated they must have been. The HOA had built its whole identity on staying neat and orderly. And now? Now they were confronted with a whole street of nonconformist homeowners who'd concluded that neat and orderly were not the only options. The next move was to take it seriously. The HOA threatened fines no longer. No, this time they were threatening lawsuits, large ones. They sent out new notices, all stamped in bold, with a legal notice. Take down all unauthorized mythical creatures or face legal action. Now, when a legal notice like that shows up in your mailbox, it's difficult not to take it seriously. And that's what the HOA was counting on. They assumed that the homeowners would be intimidated, that they would remove their gnomes and trolls and fairies in a state of panic. Because let's face it, nobody wants to go to court, right? But here's the thing. The homeowners weren't giving up. They didn't take down the mythical creatures. Instead, things only got worse. More and more residents got in on the action, plastering their lawns with even more outlandish fantasy figures. One neighbor installed a giant dragon in their front lawn. Another included a full-size unicorn. Another constructed a cardboard and fairy light, fake wizard's tower. It was as if a fantasy fairy tale had burst right in the middle of a suburban neighborhood. And as these acts of defiance increased, so did tension between the residents and the HOA. The residents weren't just holding their ground anymore. They were digging their heels in. They were saying, "You can't take our fun away. You can't make us all the same. We have the right to express ourselves." But that didn't sit well with the HOA. They weren't about to let this go. They weren't going to allow a whole lot of garden gnomes ruin their tidy, neat neighborhood and make it a fairyland. They couldn't permit that. Imagine the HOA board meetings now. My guess is it was a pressure cooker situation. There had to have been some shouting, some fiery arguments about what they had to do. HOA members, some were strictly about enforcing the rules. Others, however, were beginning to wonder if it was all worth the fuss. But those in authority, the ones who were calling the shots, they demanded results, and quickly. So they pursued the legal option. They filed a formal grievance. They called a lawyer and began planning on having a great fight. They were bent on getting those monsters off Maple Lane once and for all. As the threats grew, so did the homeowners' additions to their list of mythical creatures. They seemed to be challenging the HOA to make a move. Others began to feel like this was no longer just about gnomes. It was about freedom. Freedom to be yourself. Freedom to make your house look however you desire. And for many of these residents, that was something to fight for. But as things heated up, so did the stakes. The HOA was no longer a committee writing letters. They were now actively attempting to apply their rules. And the residents? Well, they weren't letting go either. Something was going to break. The community was more split than ever. You had the HOA on one side, a monolith based on upholding order. You had the residents on the other side, demanding their right to be themselves, to have some fun and not to have someone control their decisions. Things were getting serious. Folks were choosing sides, and with each new mythical beast that cropped up on somebody's lawn, they were reminded of how far it had reached. A plain old gnome had become a movement. And meanwhile, all of this was going on out on the street, outside. The world was watching. Neighbors were chattering. Folks were discussing Maple Lane as if it were the next big reality show. Who would win this war of brains? Would the HOA be able to shut down this fantasy insurrection? Or would the people of Maple Lane demonstrate that they had the ability to fight back? It was anyone's guess. Okay, now that things had reached the legal level, you can just picture the drama of the situation. We're discussing lawyers, lawsuits, and a fight to decide the future of Maple Lane. The HOA was not playing around anymore. They'd already delivered their cease and desist notices, threatening the homeowners with repercussions if they kept their fantasy animals on display. But now it was game time. The HOA had hired a lawyer, and it was not just a general lawyer. It was a firm that handled community regulations, rules, and HOA enforcement. They were not going to do this lightly. They were prepared for an all-out legal fight. Here's the thing. HOA regulations, as uptight and sometimes absurd as they are enforceable. When you purchase a home in a community that's subject to an HOA, you consent to abide by their rules, whether you want to or not. So when the HOA chose to proceed legally, They were appealing to their rights under contract. They were telling them, this is not about garden gnomes. This is about keeping the community standards up. But here's where it gets interesting. This was no longer just a lawn and decorating case. No, it was freedom of expression versus, and they would take the HOA to court if necessary. One courageous homeowner stepped forward and took the lead. They also visited a lawyer, one who was familiar with the intricacies of HOA regulations, yet respected the residents' freedom to express themselves creatively. And so, the legal battle commenced. Now picture the courtroom scene. On one side, you have the HOA attorneys, with all their legalese, all the regulations they've been imposing for years, and all the authority of a corporate entity backing them up. On the other side, you have a band of dedicated homeowners, standing firm and saying, this is our community, and we're not going away. The case was the subject of local gossip. People from across Maple Lane, and even from neighboring neighborhoods, gathered to observe the events. They weren't watching the gnomes alone. They were watching because this was more than about lawn decorations. This was about having the right to express yourself in your own home. As the case progressed, tensions escalated. The HOA attorney contended that the regulations were simple, that the homeowners were breaking the codes of the community. They claimed the gnomes and trolls created a nuisance and did not meet the appearance criteria of Maple Lane. This is an orderly community, they contended. We cannot have anarchy gain footholds here. And the neighbors, well, they had their own arguments. Their attorney claimed that the HOA's actions weren't merely about keeping an orderly neighborhood. They were about stifling creativity and individuality. They claimed that the homeowners weren't doing anything dangerous. They weren't damaging anything. And in fact, they were beautifying the neighborhood in a way that brought happiness to all who saw it. The residents also emphasized that, for years, the HOA had been cracking down on rules with an iron fist, dictating every detail of life on Maple Lane. They made it plain that this wasn't merely about gnomes. It was about being able to decorate their own houses and lawns in any way they chose. The HOA couldn't simply compel everyone to adhere to one monolithic standard. It soon became evident that this would not be an easy case. Both sides presented compelling arguments. But there was one factor that made all the difference: the public sentiment. The community was not polarized by the issue. It was consolidated. Nearly all of the residents of Maple Lane rallied behind the residents who were contesting the HOA. It was not about the gnomes any longer. It was about defending the right to be different. As the case lingered on, the pressure grew. The HOA wasn't merely battling a few homeowners. They were battling a movement. The longer the case lasted, the greater the backing for the residents grew. The fantasy trappings became beacons of defiance, proof of the strength of the people. And then there was the turning point. In a surprise twist, the judge presiding over the case decided to call in an expert, someone who was familiar with HOA regulations, but also with the importance of community spirit. The expert was asked to determine if the rules of the HOA were too controlling, and if they were indeed suppressing the creativity and uniqueness of the homeowners. The expert's conclusions? Well, they opened my eyes. The expert testified that the rules of the HOA were in fact too strict, and that they failed to allow homeowners any room for personal expression. The expert also testified that although the HOA had a right to enforce certain rules, they didn't have a right to stifle creativity.